Hi there, it's Catherine, your lawyer friend and guide, and this is the #1 podcast for legal careers in Japan. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lawyer on Air and to the premiere of Season 12. For this episode, I am joined by Lesli Ligorner, an attorney whose career has taken her across Japan, China, and the United States, building over 2 decades of experience working across cultures, teams, and legal systems. We talk about what it really takes to lead in Asia, including the nuances of managing teams across China and Japan, and how to give direction in a way that lands, not just linguistically, but culturally. She also shares how what others may have seen as limitations or blind spots became her competitive advantage, and how she has learned to find flexibility within even the most rigid statutory frameworks. There is also a beautiful full circle story here, starting with a high school homestay in Japan that sparked a lifelong connection to the region. If you have ever wondered how you will lead a team in Japan in the future, this is absolutely the episode for you. And as always, if this episode resonates, please send me a message to tell me that. So let's get into it. Hello, Lesli, and welcome to the show.
Hello, and good morning, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We start with the warm-up question. Imagine we are meeting up in person. Where are we, and what are you ordering from the beverage menu?
Okay, so we are at Marzak 7 along the Meguro River in Nakameguro, or we're at 1DL on Brick Road next to Ebisu Garden Place. My dogs are at our feet, and we're enjoying some good conversation and people watching, along with a glass of rosé champagne or white wine, Viognier or Puy Fumé.
So we're meeting up in the evening?
Well, no, it could be late afternoon.
Wow, that is lovely. I mean, rosé champagne seems to be the go-to these days. I didn't used to drink it so much, but it looks so good in the glass.
I love it, yeah.
Oh, wow. And is that your go-to, as you are between 2 countries, you're between Japan and China, is that your go-to beverage for both, or is it because you're now sitting in Tokyo right now, and so therefore those 2 restaurants were also places that are in Tokyo? So it's your drink for Tokyo.
Actually, no, we'd be in Shanghai, we'd be like somewhere along the West Bund, and there would be a glass of rosé champagne or white wine in my hand as well.
Wow.
But the theme would be the dogs. My dogs would be at our feet.
Definitely. You've got 2 dogs.
I do, yes.
And their names?
One is Mochi and one is Coca.
Oh,
and they're
cute.
both Samoyeds.
Oh, my goodness. I bet you get everybody coming up to you.
That's the fun. Yes.
I've got one friend, and we've actually met, I think, at the Brick Road place that you mentioned, and she goes up to dog owners all the time and chats to the dogs. So I'm sure if we were meeting, she would be right there and patting them. Fantastic. Well, you have, as I just mentioned, lived and worked across Japan and China, and of course also in the US. So take us right back. What was it that sparked your interest in the law? And I guess at that time, did you always think it was going to be an international career that you would have?
So I never knew that law would take me internationally, but I always knew I wanted to do something international. When I graduated from university, I was working in banking. And after the first World Trade Center bombing, our office was in the first tower. I decided banking was not where my passion was, and I pivoted to law school. And so I never knew what the trajectory would be to get me on an international journey, but it ended up being my legal career, which was fantastic.
Wow. And where did Japan and Japanese language come into play for you along that way?
So in high school, I had the opportunity to live in Japan with a Japanese family, a homestay, and it basically turned me away from Europe and basically started my journey towards Asia. I returned the next summer, and I had just graduated from high school. I returned and lived with another family in downtown Tokyo.
Oh, wow.
And, my love for Japan and for Asia was sparked, and I've never looked back.
Yeah, it gets you, doesn't it? It either does or it doesn't. It seems to be very black and white. There's nobody who's really sort of, I kind of like it here. You like it or you don't.
Right, right.
Wow. So you studied East Asian studies as well before law.
Yes. The East Asian Studies was after I had lived for 2 summers in
Right,
Japan.
I see.
I then did my junior year in Japan, studied Japanese for 6 years every day.
Wow.
Um, what that experience enabled me to do was realize that I could live in Asia and be comfortable living in Asia. I think a big part of that was living as a minority for the first
Mhm.
time in my life. And that was a really different experience, particularly as a high schooler. But when the opportunity came up in 2005, I seized it and I jumped on the opportunity of a lifetime, which was to leave my work in New York. It was a wild risk, transfer my docket to others, and start pivoting to learn everything I could about Chinese employment law at a time when it was really just so rapidly changing. And that was the start of my career in Asia.
It's amazing. I just want to go back a couple of steps because you talked about the bank work
Yep.
and obviously that terrible time when you decided not to be staying in that industry. But your bio says that your husband raised your hand for Shanghai.
He
Tell me
did.
about that moment. I mean, that pivot, it just flowed off your tongue to say employment law in China. But tell me about that because I mean, there's a difference between coming and homestaying and spending time as a student and doing the study, but then actually coming to live and work here is a big thing. What happened? I'm so intrigued by this moment.
So it really made me think back to what it was. So when I was working in banking, it was the early 90s. It was very traditional. And at that time, I saw the glass ceiling very clearly, and I knew I wanted and I needed for my own personality a different trajectory. So I went to law school. I then ended up working for the city of New York. So I was in government service. I got experience that was fantastic, trial experience, and I would have never gotten that if I went in house or if I went to a private firm into private practice. And so after several years, my husband, who's not from the United States, was antsy to get out of New York. And I said, I'm not taking another bar. So when the opportunity came up to move to China, he basically said, let's do it, raised my hand. And I said, we don't speak Chinese. And he said, we'll learn. And that was it.
We'll learn. I love how he said we'll learn, not you. We will. And did you
We.
both learn?
We did. He immediately started going to school and
Wow.
learning Chinese. And I immediately jumped into the job and didn't spend as much time as I should have. But
Mhm.
I relied on my Japanese, which my Japanese, provided me with the characters. It provided me with a different way of thinking in terms of how you structure your thoughts and a different way of communicating because it is much less exact than English or is similar to Japanese. So that's how I was able to learn Chinese more easily.
Right. So Chinese is indirect, like Japanese is.
Yes.
Ah, that's interesting because I've always thought it's very direct, but maybe it's the tones of the language that makes me feel that, but it's quite indirect.
It is, one of the biggest things in law in particular that I have to get over with and work on with my team when we give advice is giving advice in active voice because
Ah,
it is so indirect. Most people will write in passive voice, and that doesn't always work for, concise, practical advice for clients.
well, that's a great tip there right away, right? Give it to me directly in an active voice. That's amazing. Wow. So as you said, yes, obviously, and you're here. Did you think it would be a short chapter though, or maybe it would be something that would really flip and redefine your career?
So I never imagined I would spend 2 decades in Asia.
Yeah, 2 decades.
Yeah, it's my 20th anniversary is in a couple weeks.
Oh, wow.
We always thought that it would be, 5 to 7 years, and then after I spent the first couple years, I used to say 7 to 10, and then I just stopped counting because there was just so much more to do, and there was so much more to learn, and it was just so exciting, and it's never stopped, and so that's why I'm still here.
Yeah, so what does this tell you about, this planning of long term, 10 years, 5 years, whatever it might be, and the actual nature of an international assignment, the flow of what actually really happens?
So I think for people who think that they're going to come for just 1 or 2 years, it's very difficult to really make a difference if you're going to work on local local matters. I think a lot of people will come if they have got a big matter to work on, a litigation or an investigation, and it takes a couple years, and then you're involved in that matter. But to really get to know the different aspects of the law, to really get to know how it works on, from paper to actual implementation and practice, it takes time. And then you've got the cultural overlay. And I think that's really where my value has only increased, is because the longer I stay in Asia, and particularly China and Japan, the more I can appreciate why the law plays out the way it does and how to find flexibility within the rigid confines of a code jurisdiction.
Tell me a bit more about that.
So coming from the US, for example, where it's at will employment, and my focus is on employment law
Yeah.
and employee behavior is a lot of what I do. You have the flexibility in the US to just terminate at will. And you can terminate very easily in places like Singapore and Hong Kong, where, you can terminate on notice. China, Japan, they're code jurisdictions, as is Korea and many other jurisdictions. And you've got to find the flexibility within the rigid, statutory confines in order to be able to achieve the goals that the client wants to achieve. It's not always straightforward, and it's not always linear. And so to find that flexibility, I think it requires understanding the culture, how people react, how you can approach a conversation a little bit more empathetically when you're conducting a termination, for example. That is the value add, I think, that I don't just look at it as, okay, this is the law and this is what you need to do. It's how can we look at this holistically and make this a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I get that. Thank you. And has there been a moment then across China or in Japan that has really changed your trajectory, or something has happened that's enabled you to actually decide to continue in this 20th anniversary that's coming up? Has there been something like that that's happened for you?
If I think back, and your questions really do make me think back as to what drives me. Why am I here still? I came to China as a counsel. And, I'm not Asian, I'm not male. And everyone at that time when I came wanted to talk to a partner. I knew I could add something, and the bias because I wasn't Chinese or a native Chinese speaker and female, that motivated me to find my niche. And it was looking holistically at people in the workplace and looking at the root cause of misbehavior and corrupt activity. And it all starts with a person or an employee. And so that's what drives me, is basically understanding people don't expect me to be able to find the answer and to be able to find some type of acceptable resolution and achieve goals for clients. So that's the fun of it.
That makes a lot of sense. Was there a particular client situation? You can't tell me details, and I don't want you to, but something that maybe was happening that actually made you really consolidate on that? It might have been a leadership opportunity or some particular case that really sticks in your mind as a turning point.
I think it was gradually, there were so many times that there would be whispers, again, that I'm not Chinese, I'm not a native Chinese speaker, I'm not Asian. So how could I help companies in China or Japan or Korea? And so there were those deliberate attempts to undermine me. And all that did was give me more drive and ambition to prove everybody wrong. And so what was interesting was that blind spot that others created in their minds, that proved to be an advantage for me. Because I never saw myself as operating in a Chinese only or a Japanese only environment. I always, looked at things across jurisdictions so I can help Western companies understand how to operate in China and Japan and help Asian companies understand how to better operate in the US.
Truly a bridge. That is just gold, right? That blind spot that others are picking out that becomes your positive point. I love that. So at that time, when you said a deliberate attempts to undermine you, how did you work through that? It's obvious an experience that stayed with you, but how did you work through that, and how has it really changed you to lead the way you do now?
So I wish I had the Mel Robbins podcast, and I know that you're a fan as well, where she says, let them.
Yeah.
And I wish I had learned early on and, to just let them say what they wanted. But for me, it was more about I had to prove that I had something to give. And that was basically being successful with clients and building a team that would also support me. And it's not just about me, it's about the team and me. And having them also be able to think critically and flexibly and to prove others wrong. It's more about understanding how to give advice and be a strong lawyer than to be culturally from that location or to be a fluent speaker of that language. And that's what drives me.
Being successful with clients, there must be so many interpretations of that. Is it more like because you're sort of talking about a how to give advice, it feels like a feeling to me, or how you make clients feel when they've worked with you, that they want to come back, or they want to talk about you, or they want to refer you on, or just like you. What does successful with clients mean to you?
When I get a request from a client, I really do try and put myself in the client's shoes and think about how they can achieve their goals. I find it very difficult when someone, contacts me and they give me a very broad remit. I want to understand what is the ultimate goal here and how can I help you get there? And being able to achieve a successful resolution of a matter or finding a flexible way or an acceptable way for the client to go forward from, to get from A to B. And it might mean we have to go through C, D, and F. That's what drives me. That's what keeps me going every day. I love that. And so that's what I think is successful is they may never come back. If it's certain matters, they only need me once and they never want to talk to me again. And that's fine because we've achieved the goal. But other clients, they'll come back for various matters. And every time I try and, give the best advice and try and be as practical as possible. Again, trying to sit in their shoes if I was in house and to achieve the goal of whatever they want to happen.
Yeah, and I liked how you said acceptable way forward because it may not be the best way forward or the first or the only way forward, but acceptable is kind of has a little bit of negotiation in there that there's been things going on, but it's the way that they've accepted the pathway to go forward. I like that description.
Yeah, it's not always the most expedient way. It's not always the most effective way because there's so many other facets to think about. So I think of everything in terms of risk. I'm a litigator at heart. And so I use acceptable because it may not be what they've thought of first, or it might not be what another lawyer might suggest, but I feel like I can get you there. This is the best way that I see managing all the risk along the way.
Yeah, I see. So does being a litigator at heart and having these successful resolutions for clients, does that actually help you then in mentoring your team and bringing your team along with you?
I think it does. One of the best things about my job is my team and being able to, teach them what I've had to learn, which is critical thinking and finding the flexibility within the rules and having them challenge me if they see a different way of going forward. That creates better, stronger work that we can then provide to clients. And that drives me, and I love that. So it's the give and take with my team is really important, but it's teaching them to think very critically and practically and flexibly. That's been most rewarding when I see them take that forward.
Yeah, I think that part of challenging you, if they've got a different way, that can be quite hard within these hierarchical cultures. So there must be a way that you've been able to build the safety, the environment where they can feel they can do that, or without insisting on it, but in some way you're doing that. Can you give us a tip how you do that?
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the most challenging things, particularly when I first came to China, because no one would tell me if I was misinterpreting something or if I translated something incorrectly. And it took time for people to feel more comfortable. And I tried to really create a safe environment, explain this isn't about blame. This is about how do we make sure that we give accurate advice to clients, because we all go down as a team and as a firm and as a department and as an office if we can't give accurate advice. So you've got to let me know I'm not the native Chinese speaker and these are Chinese laws, or I'm not the native Japanese speaker and these are Japanese laws. You've got to let me know if I've got it wrong. And it took time, and not everyone works well within that framework. Some people have left along the way because they just cannot challenge, or they can only cast blame on whoever got it wrong. and they can't work within the team and collaborate. I mean, sometimes I've got my junior associates supervising something that a senior associate is doing because they did it with me in the past. And so they understand the way that we can go forward. And that has created a much flatter team. And I think that's also why we operate really well. That's one of my prides.
Wow, that's amazing to hear that. I don't think I've heard that as an example so frankly before, that you've got that flatter team because you've got the people in there who can actually do the work, who've done it before, and naturally they would be the ones that would lead. But to actually implement that is another story. So that's great to hear. Wow.
That takes time.
Yeah,
That's one of those
time.
things when you said, is this a short-term thing?
Yeah,
That takes a long time. That,
sure does.
the team has to have trust in me and they have to have trust in our process and in their teammates. And I think, that takes time, but I happen to have a very strong team and we've been together a long time with
Right.
very little turnover. And I'm really lucky that way.
Yeah. So what surprised you then this time about working in Japan? And you're between both countries still, or you basically now in Japan, but moving around a bit too to look after China issues?
I do go back and forth. I travel quite regularly back to China. There's really not that much difference between managing my team in China versus Japan.
Yeah.
It's about understanding culturally how I can motivate them to be better lawyers, to be stronger lawyers. And that is a little different between Japan and China, particularly because I'm new to Japan. So building that trust, building that relationship with my colleagues in Japan, that takes time. And so we're still in early days.
I see. So you talked a little bit about the language and it being indirect, which was my first learning from today's conversation. But is there other experiences that have translated really well from your China experience, and then others that you've really consciously had to relearn?
I was in China for so long, I got used to the way things work. And I've had to not relearn, but I've had to adapt and basically think more closely about how do I give instructions? How do I make sure that I give enough leeway so I'm not micromanaging? Because I don't need to do that anymore with my China team. And I'm not a Bengoshi. And so I rely on our Bengoshi. And so they're really the experts. But I want to build in certain flexibility. And that's really that nuanced dance, I would say, back and forth to give advice in a way that is acceptable for a Western client, that's delicate and that takes time and that takes learning.
Sure does. Do you think you're showing up differently then because it's Japan and you're dealing with Bengoshi compared to instilling that leeway that you've been talking about there, the difference between being a lawyer and a leader between both countries? Because this is an interesting topic, and I think nuanced dance is a perfect capture of what you were talking about here. And I think it would be really informational and interesting for people who are listening who are managing two cultures and finding it a bit difficult or want to learn from you how you've done it and done it so successfully.
So what I do is I draw on my China experience in that in China, for example, someone would say, you can't do that. That's the law doesn't say that. And if the law doesn't expressly permit it, it's not permitted. And I'd say, well, let's think about that. And then there would be another way that we could express the resolution or express the way forward for a client that would fit, and it wouldn't be contrary to law, but it would be working within, again, the flexibility within a rigid, strict black letter law interpretation. I have to remind myself to bring that same step-by-step analysis and thought process to my colleagues when I'm working with them for something new in Japan that they have not faced before, that maybe I have faced it in China. And so I've thought about another way forward than the strict confines of black letter law. And so that gets them thinking a little bit more creatively, and it gets me the ability to provide a more flexible response to a client. It's going back in time to when I had to first do that when I came to China. I'm relearning how to do that again in Japan.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, because when you first came here to Asia, what do you wish you'd really understood a bit more than what you do now?
Having to really tear things apart to their basic level and suggest that there might be other ways forward. In other words, it's not simply what everyone else has said is the only way forward, that there may be some flexibility. And I use that word all the time because that's really what it is, we've got to look at the black letter law, of course, but we also need to think about a Western company operating in Asia that requires flexibility. And so we've got to bring that flexibility to the client so they can achieve their goals. And I think that's the biggest learning is understanding how to look at something a little more flexibly and how to bring that so that the team understands, my colleagues understand, and can then think that way themselves.
Right. So for some lawyers thinking about building a career here, they might go, oh my goodness, that sounds too hard. I just want to do what I'm doing. And maybe the answer to this question is just stay where you are then. But what would you suggest then that they need to have in their tool belt coming here to work in either China or Japan? But since this is a Japan focused podcast, what about Japan?
So I would say first you've got to be a strong lawyer. I find it amazing when you hear about, young lawyers who come straight out of law school to come to Japan to learn. I find that amazing.
Mm,
I never thought that that would be possible. So I look at them and say, wow, that's incredible. For me, that was not the path that I thought would work because I wanted that strong legal base, at least from my own jurisdiction. And then, for anyone wanting to come, I think you have to look at why you want to be here. There
mm,
has to be a business case or there has to be a problem or a gap that you can fill. It can't be simply because you want to live in that market, or I think it is really hard to then get beyond a certain level and to really achieve success, become a partner if that's the goal, or to really understand different aspects of the law because you don't have that foundation from your original law school base. That
yeah.
would be my thought.
Yeah. Why do you want to be here? I get dozens, I would say, of messages on LinkedIn of I really love Japanese manga and I
Mm,
want to come to Japan, or I really enjoy their food, or I went as a tourist. And it's like, yes, but it is a little different to that. Yes, we have that, and it
yeah.
can be a bit different. What do you think then is some of the things that people get wrong about doing business in Asia, in Japan and China, that you think they should have probably done some research on or chatted to people like you and me perhaps before coming here? The things that people get a little bit skewed.
I think understanding how it is very challenging. If you're not a strong lawyer and you don't have a strong basis from your own jurisdiction, I think then it is really challenging to add value aside from just being a foreign language speaker. The other thing is Asia's not one market. So when someone says, I want to do what you did, I want to come to Asia and work, and there's such a difference between the countries and even the cities.
Mm,
I don't think of, going to Indonesia or the Philippines or Thailand, for example. You go to Manila, you go to Jakarta, you go to Bangkok. Those are where the economic drivers are. So while you might like the beaches in Thailand, that's not where you're working. You're going to Bangkok.
yeah.
So, Japan, people are, enamored with the culture. When you're going to and from work in Tokyo or Osaka, you're in a crowded train. You're not necessarily going out all the time to eat. It's a very different experience working here.
Yeah,
And I
it
think,
sure is.
and it's also, it's a lot harder as a foreigner. There's a lot of cultural barriers to break through in order to be able to have a social life, in order to be able to actually access clients and work with clients directly and not just be a translator, essentially.
Yeah. Have you got an example of one of those cultural barriers you've broken through then? Because you had language. So there may be also listeners who think, well, she had language, so that might be my key. But you mentioned before, it's not only the language and being a language speaker, you've got to have a strong basis in your own jurisdiction, but some cultural barrier, Leslie, that maybe you've broken through that you can relate to for others to listen to and learn from.
So for me, I don't think I could have come here even when I went to China in 2006. It was a different time. Everyone was rushing into China and wanting to learn and wanting to create rule of law and understand how Western companies were operating, and Western companies needed to understand how to operate in China. And so I was able to really thrive in that chaotic environment. That's not Japan. Japan is not chaotic at all in the same way. I mean, there's a lot of laws, there's a lot of rules. And so managing in that, I would not have been able to do what I did in China if I came to Japan right away. And so now what's easier for me is I have a foundation and I can talk and speak to a very different career and a very different set of experience that translates back into working in Japan. Again, because it's a code jurisdiction and because I've had so much experience with Japan-China work as well, that I think that's really where there's a big difference between where I was 20 years ago and coming now and being able to break through now some of those barriers because I do have that very strong foundation of my practice before I came to Japan, 18 years in China.
That's right. And it brings me to that leadership across cultures because you've been leading the teams in two different, very distinct areas. What does it take then to build that trust across the jurisdictions and teams? You've talked about it a little bit here, but I wonder about, say you're doing a playbook for leadership across two quite different cultures. What would you put in there for your top, maybe one or two things that have really been distinct for you to help with your leadership across these cultures?
Learning to adapt. I don't think it's unlearning as a leader, but I think it's learning to adapt to your environment, to your audience. I think there are certain management structures that are common across both cultures, not wanting to escalate issues, or at least not wanting to escalate them directly, doing them anonymously if they will escalate anything, wanting to save face, and respecting colleagues. And I think those three things, understanding that I need to, as I lead, create a safe place for people to come, to let me know if they have issues, to let me know if others have issues, and to try and manage through that while making sure everyone feels respected. And so that's not as direct leadership as it would be if I was in the States, I believe.
Exactly. So for lawyers who are listening who want to have this kind of international career that you are being a poster partner for, what would you say to them? What kind of advice for lawyers who's someone's rocked up to you and said, I want to have an international career like you? What's your advice for me?
So the first thing I'd say is learn everything you can and be a strong lawyer. Figure out where your strength is in the law, where you want to focus, because these are long hours and these are sometimes grueling competition. And you got to be able to show up and you have to love it. And if you don't love it and you don't feel strong and confident in your knowledge base, it's not going to work. That's my one thought. And the second thing is, again, going back to what we just discussed, is international is great, but think about where you want to be and why you want to be there. And sometimes it's about taking any opportunity that comes up. I never planned to go to China. I was always focused on Japan, but the Japan opportunity didn't come up. And in hindsight, it would have never worked if it did come up. So I took a leap of faith into a jurisdiction I had studied about, and going back to my university years, I knew a lot about East Asian history and culture from my studies, and how that played out, again, helped me adapt culturally as a lawyer. And so I think understanding the market where you want to be, or the city where you're going to end up, or where you want to focus, that's really important. And having that background of, having thought through that, I think is critical before you say, I want to go to that location. Unless, of course, you're, again, seizing an opportunity. That would be amazing.
Great advice. Goodness. Before we go into the quickfire round, I just wanted to ask you a final reflection on you and that time where you had your hand put up and you came to Asia. If you could go back and speak to yourself again before you got on that plane, what would you say to that person, that Lesli of those days? And then maybe what your future self would say to you now as well.
I think I would tell myself, enjoy the ride. It'll be worth it. And I think what my future self would say to me now is the same thing. Enjoy the ride. It'll be worth it.
Isn't it amazing when it's the same thing from either side of where you are, the bookends? Amazing. Well, thank you for that. Let's get into the quickfire round. I'm super keen to know what your lawyer superpower is. You've talked about a lot of things like flexibility. Is there something you haven't mentioned that is your real superpower?
My real superpower.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's probably my energy. I have
Mm.
trouble sitting still, which is really helpful in this job because, as I said, it requires long hours and lots of travel.
Wow, great. I congratulate you on sitting at least for an hour today. Do you have a book or a podcast or another leadership resource that you can recommend?
I love reading and I love podcasts. One book that has really stuck with me is The Loudest Duck by Laura Liswood. She used to be an executive at Goldman Sachs. That's one. And then the other, I'm a huge fan of the podcast How to Fail with Elizabeth Day. And I find that I always learn something by hearing about someone else who talks about their failures.
Oh, I love it. I haven't heard of that book either. That's an interesting sounding one.
It's good.
Wow. Well, if not law, what would you be doing, do you think, Leslie?
Actually, I'm really lucky. I love what I do. And I thought long and hard about this question.
Yeah, you knew it
I,
was coming.
yeah, I've heard you ask other people.
Mm,
I love their responses, but I can't imagine right now doing anything different. I really do love what I do.
interesting. Because so many people have said architect or design and it's quite out there. It's left field, but it's a kind of creative inclination that some people seem to have. But if you love the law, you love the law.
Well, I like the creativity I can find in law, the creative thinking, and again, that ties into the flexibility I was mentioning.
Yes. Is there a recent discovery you've had in Japan?
I love food here. And so I was walking my dogs the other day in Meguro and found an amazing little store with an amazing wine selection and amazing cheeses and other nibbles. And so,
Mm,
yeah, that was my most recent discovery.
can you tell me offline?
Will do.
Okay. And one thing that people would be surprised to learn about you, they may not even know it in the office.
I am terrified of heights, but I was a paragliding instructor.
No.
Yes.
What? Hang on. How did that happen? How can that be?
I know because I met my husband as a blind date and he was an avid paragliding pilot. So it was either learn to fly or be a weekend widow. And that was not my thing. I had to learn.
Oh my goodness, that I did not expect. That's amazing. Wow, I have to go there some another time over the rosé. Oh,
Right.
and I have to ask this one because it's been a really successful question for people in season 11. We've just finished. If you described your career as a metaphor, and some people have said water or an animal of some sort, what would your metaphor for your career be and why would that be?
So I think it would be a roller coaster. I've
Uh-huh.
had amazing highs, I've had soul destroying lows, and I never know what's around the corner.
Okay, are you in the front seat or the back seat?
Oh, I'm in the front.
All right.
Absolutely.
Oh, roller coaster. There we go. Well, thank you so much, Les. This has been amazing. We have reached the end of our chat today, but thank you so much for joining me on Lawyer on Air. It's been an absolute pleasure to learn from you and discover things I did not know, even though we've sat round ball gala tables, we didn't get to this conversation. So thank you so much. Have you enjoyed yourself?
I have. Thank you, Catherine. It's really made me reflect on so many different aspects of my work. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Oh, good. That's great. So before we finish up, where's the best place for listeners to reach you? Would that be on your firm's website or through LinkedIn? What's good?
Both work, both go to the
Okay.
same firm email address.
Oh,
So
perfect. Well, we'll put that information in the show notes so listeners can find you easily. And to my listeners, if this episode has inspired you or gave you something to think about, and I'm sure it has, we would love to hear from you. We make reviews. We love receiving reviews. We love people subscribing and leaving 5 stars on their reviews. So please do that for us. Your feedback really helps more listeners like you to find this show and discover answers to questions they always wanted to know about a career in law, but they didn't know where to find them. So thank you again today. We'll see you back here on the next episode. Cheers, kampai, and bye for now.